Hello, hello. We're here with the Grandpa Rich today, exploring some European documentation, node emergence story and patterns and vibes, because that's what you bring as a vibe mechanic, isn't it, Rich?
Yes, I'm glad you call me granddad. That's kind of the vibe I'm in, so it's good.
I've heard you introducing yourself in that way a couple of times, so I thought it's appropriate. I wanted to hear your perspective on emergence of Enspiral Europe node. And as I've been kind of tracking all sorts of different snippets and pieces on Lumio and Slack and all the channels that we use for building Enspiral, I found a post from you, which I'm going to sort of quote. And it was in January 2020. You wrote something like, hey, we're doing this experiment in Enspiral and we're going to do a Europe thing. And we don't know what it's going to be, but we're going to run it for a while. And we anticipate that it could catalyze a major change in the operative system of Enspiral. And we might move towards this decentralized nodes that are locally rooted. And guess what? 2 years later, we're there. We have our first nodes prototype from Europe. So I'm really curious to hear first, maybe why did this whole thing happened? What's your perspective on that? What's the origin story?
I will tell you that. I want to put a post-it note already and say, let's come back to that post and like what I was doing there. I think there's something interesting there.
There's a post-it note for you.
Great. Wow. So why? The biggest why, let's go there first, is, I think everyone that has that's like a values-driven sort of mission-oriented kind of person, people tend to come up with a diagnosis of like the one thing that's wrong with everything or something like that, and it's like, it's capitalism, it's patriarchy, it's whatever. And my one thing that's wrong with everything is like, we seem to be living at a time where trust is decaying in society, and it's like somehow we're becoming further apart from each other and more fearful and anxious. And given the material reality of the moment we're living in, we actually need to be coming together and being more harmonious and connected and to act in harmony. And so it's like, how do we get out of this negative feedback loop and into a positive spiral of accumulating trust? And for me, there's kind of no choice. We have to do that. I mean, the choice is either we build trust and grow more connection and then make some significant changes in the world, or we do it the kind of authoritarian way where we just like some very powerful person will just force everyone to change. I would rather do it the trustful way. And then the question is like, where does trust come from? And in my framing, my mental model, it accumulates through one relationship at a time, like it's actually very small scale. It's like the really awesome group of parents at the kindergarten or these like one-on-one encounters where you have like meaningful friendship, like it starts to build. And when you have your your bank balance of trust is like topped up, you're like more awake, aware, friendly, courageous, like just you become it's like this like key resource to people. And so like why Enspiral in general for me is like, it's just giving people a place to belong and to accumulate really high trust relationships with people, because that is just like a necessary precondition to doing anything good in the world. And then just at the small scale, it makes a big difference. And then there's this kind of like vague hope that if there was lots of people doing something Enspiral-ish, then society would be in a lot better place. So that's the big why. And then the more specific why, like why did we branch off the Enspiral global and start to draw a boundary and say, here's a subgroup, we're going to call it a node, and we're going to have our own rhythms and our own kind of subculture almost. One of the impulses for that was we did a thing called EOA, Enspiral Organizing Academy, which was Joriam and Phoebe and me and Nati and Ants, who are all like been around Enspiral for a long time. We ran it was like a paid training / retreat for 5 days, I think it was, in Belgium. And we just had fun, we brought 30 something people together for a week and did some good stuff. And then we're like, wow, this was rad. It really felt like Enspiral has landed in Europe somehow. I think this was maybe 2017, 2018, something like that. So there was that, which Phoebe really took as an impulse of like, wow, it's awesome to have Enspiral people around and doing stuff in Europe and drawing people in, having gatherings. And then there was another step in the puzzle, which I can't really put my finger on, about Stephen Reed was involved right in the early days as well. So, because he's done a lot of community organizing. And somewhere between, I think it was that 2020 summer. Sorry, winter, the like December 2019 kind of time, that Stephen and Phoebe put their hands up and said, we're going to run a gathering, and it's going to kind of initiate or test if we want to have an Inspiralish thing. And then pandemic happened, and so gatherings couldn't happen. But why? Like, that's kind of like some of the points in the plot that got us to there. I mean, for a very long time, well, first of all, I joined Enspiral in like 2011, and it immediately had this very large positive impact on me. And so I became pretty committed to it pretty quickly. And there was, in my experience, kind of like a golden age of Enspiral from like 2011 to 2015 or something like that. And then, I don't know exactly the years, but then there was a certain point where it felt like the network couldn't be as experimental as it used to be. It couldn't be as like, felt like we'd accumulated a bunch of, it was like a software program that has just been in use for too long. And it's like, we'd accumulated all of this old code that was not actually very relevant anymore, but it was quite hard to change. Things were getting a bit sticky. And there's actually a talk, you can find a talk on YouTube with Joshua Weil talking at the New Frontiers conference, where he's actually suggesting, and I think it's 2016 that he said this, I could track it down, but ages ago, he said, yeah, we're thinking about maybe what we need to do is decentralize Enspiral a bit more and like break it off into more like a federated structure. And that was way back then. There was this kind of emerging sense with a bunch of the people that were, you know, most heavily involved in the network, that that the network was somehow self-constraining, and that we needed to like break it up into different chunks to create more freedom and more autonomy. That like trying to bring everyone along on a journey of like, oh, we want to reorganize things was just like too hard. And maybe if we had smaller subgroups, we could be more creative and try stuff out and have more like local variations that are adapted to local context. And like, you know, there's some people who are like, Enspiral, the minimum requirement should be everyone goes on a 1-week retreat together every 6 months. And it's just really hard to get everyone to agree with that, you know, because it's quite a high level of commitment. But you might be able to find 30 people that agree with that. And that could be a really awesome community. So I think that was a big part of the why. It was just like coming from a global perspective and going, the network feels a little bit less innovative than it used to be. What new things could we try that would like uncork some energy and allow for some new innovation and growth to happen? So that was a big part of it. And then the other part was just like really personal, that Nati, my wife, and I, we'd moved from New Zealand, which is like Enspiral headquarters, to Europe, which is like a satellite, remote, distant, you know, like, oh. And because Enspiral had been so important to me, it was like, well, obviously I'm going to need more Enspiral when I'm living in Europe. And it's not satisfying to be just a satellite of a New Zealand thing. So we had this impulse. I think that was me and Nati's impulse for getting involved and doing a more local thing, was like, we just need community around us, so we're going to try it. And maybe that's the other why, is like having been involved pretty early on with the formation of Enspiral in New Zealand, I got to see not just the impact that it had on the people that are in the community, but also the way that that community accumulated some power and resources to influence New Zealand as a country. And that's cool, you know. It's like during the election, a bunch of different political leaders will come to the Enspiral co-working space and be like, hey, this is what we're doing this year. What do you think about it? Do you have any input? Like, they think about Enspiral as like a relevant group of people to talk to, you know. And I like that. And I have this feeling like, imagine if we could do something like that at the European regional scale, rather than just in a little country in the Pacific, but like at a bigger scale, have this community of impactful, purpose-driven, creative, like social entrepreneur types that built some real collective organizing power so that they became a political force and could have some influence on what politics looks like in this region. Like that's the kind of lofty, I don't know if it's going to happen at all. And I'm not like pushing for that really hard, but just seeing what happened in New Zealand and thinking, oh, maybe we could do something a bit similar. Like we could really contribute to the civic landscape here in a useful way. That's fun to imagine, you know. I think, yeah, I could probably go on, but I think that's the bulk of it.
Yeah, I feel you. And I really like this is something that keeps coming up in those conversations that I've been having with people about this ethos of Enspiral, that when you see something not working, just kind of point a finger and go ahead and do it. So it seems like it was a perfect circumstance with Phoebe and Steven kind of already putting energy into, hey, let's do this European thing. And this event you mentioned that was organized, and okay, that felt good. And then just this selfish reason that you moved to Europe and like, hey, let's build something here. And this combination of maybe a little stuck energy and this super experimental organization that with time kind of just chills and doesn't move the energy enough. So yeah, it feels like a very powerful motivation at the end of the day to start something new. And it brought together a group of people, right? Because it was maybe the 4 or 5 people in the kind of very beginning. So you and Nati and Steven and Phoebe to kind of start the process with. I'm not sure if I'm missing anyone.
Yeah, well, it kind of moved because the gathering didn't happen because of the pandemic. That kind of reset the cards a little bit in a way. And as far as I remember, as soon as we knew we weren't going to be able to gather, Stephen dropped out immediately, and Phoebe didn't completely drop away, but like her enthusiasm was like, oh, okay, this is really different from what I thought it was going to be. So Joriam came in when we put that post in 2020 that you mentioned on Lumio. I think it was Joriam and Phoebe and me and Nati stepping up and saying, we're well established members of the community, and we want to do this new thing, and we want your support. And having the 4 of us, I think, really helped give people confidence that we weren't doing something really random. We weren't going to like go off and like trash the reputation or something like that, you know, like that we were doing something, understanding the spirit of Enspiral and trying to help it grow into the next step.
It makes sense, right? Because at the end of the day, you were explicitly naming a significant anticipation of a significant change on a kind of deep operational system level, which eventually happened in those 2 years.
Yeah. And I wanted to mention that like there is a kind of political sophistication to that, and that like knowing that in any kind of community or any kind of organization, when you're going to propose a significant change, that you can just expect there's going to be some resistance and some fears for good reason, you know, like things are designed the way they are for a reason, and are you going to break it? Like what's your ulterior motive, or like what do I fear is going to be lost? And you know, people have these concerns. And so that the way I wrote that post was to say, I think this is important and I think you should pay attention, and we're not in a hurry, we've got space, so you don't need to get anxious about what might go wrong. Yeah, the change we think is coming, you know, so like just giving people lots of notice and giving them the opportunity to talk to me if they had any concerns. And like there were multiple points where I got to talk with highly engaged members and say, like, I want to be open to know what your concerns might be, because what we're proposing is basically moving from an organization with one center of governance gravity to one with multiple centers, and therefore it's likely that things are that's going to introduce new challenges, you know, and that our ability to control things is actually probably going to go down as a result. And I knew that would raise some eyebrows, and so I wanted to give people lots and lots and lots of notice, and I feel quite proud of how that's gone down. Like that as far as I know, there's been no bad feeling or drama, or like I don't think anyone's got hurt along the way. I don't think we've done any harm. It's still kind of early days, you know. We might find in 3 or 4 years that, oh, we've built this really weird Frankenstein network that doesn't really work anymore. And then I might be looking back at this going like, wow, maybe I shouldn't have been so diplomatic and made it so smooth. Maybe we should have had more of a debate, but we'll see.
We'll see. Well, there's only one way to find out, right? It's to experiment. And yeah. I guess this is deliberate one of the whys, right? Like, let's make an experiment, let's see what happens, and perhaps it's going to end up a good thing and have this positive impact, not just on people involved, but maybe shaping the whole landscape of Europe, like Enspiral in New Zealand can shape New Zealand as well, which is, at the end of the day, super powerful motivation and a lot of fun to actually have real impact, not just on the people in your group. I mean, this is already worthwhile, but going this one step beyond is like, wow, this is cool.
Yeah, it is cool. And the other thing is, it's like trust. It's a bit like capital, but maybe like capital as well. I don't think you should try and accumulate too much of it. Like, as in, when you've got high trusting relationships, you should use that trust. You should spend it. You should do stuff with it. You should risk things once you've got it. And I felt like we'd built a lot of trust in Enspiral, but no one was really using it. It was just kind of sitting there. And I'm like, come on, we've got a huge opportunity that we can do this. So that was kind of my impulse as well. Was like, I think we all trust each other enough that you can delegate to us and say, hey, there's a subgroup, you're going to go off and do this wild experiment and report back and let us know what you learn. Is that cool? And people are like, yeah, it's cool. Like, okay, nice.
Amazing. I love this idea of, like, you build trust, but with the intention of actually spending it or using it, not just kind of like have this trophy in the back of your house, like, oh, we look, so much trust, but it just stands there for the memory of the future generations. Super cool. I really love this way of thinking, and just this proactivity, like, okay, let's make things. So maybe shifting gears a little bit, because you have this unique perspective of being one of the, let's say, driving forces behind Enspiral Europe, but also member of the board in Enspiral, let's say, Global. I'm kind of curious, one, what was this perspective and perception of the board and Enspiral as this bigger entity of seeing, hey, what's happening in Europe? And then also, how did it happen that, hey, at the end of the day, there are some requirements, right? Like, okay, you can go ahead and play with this European thing, but we ask you to respect a certain protocols just to make sure that it's still Enspiral, even if with a different flavor.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important context to realize that as we developed the board, many years ago, it was called the minimum viable board. And part of what that means is, like, the job of the board is just to make sure that we're being legally compliant. And it's not about setting the strategy or having a vision for how the network should grow or anything like that. And so the board's reaction to seeing this new energy in Europe was just good, just happy, just like, great, there's something happening. There's some enthusiasm. Let's get behind it and see if we can support it. That was really all the board had to say about it. But as the European experiment has matured and it's like more established, and we're like, yeah, we need to do the governance structure upgrade to say there's a thing called a node and it has its own distinctive decision-making criteria and all this sort of stuff. The board is actually, like, the way that we've done the rearrangement of our rules, we've got rid of the central member circle, which used to be this, like, shareholders group in the middle that would be the kind of ultimate locus of power. That doesn't exist anymore. And as a consequence, the minimum is not so minimum anymore on the board. Like, the board has got a bigger responsibility than they used to. And they've got to be a little bit more awake to any risks. And that's, I think, the attitude that's gone behind, like, developing these requirements for forming a new node is like, let's just simulate what are some, like, bad outcomes of a group of people starting an Enspiral node. Like, how could that go wrong? Like, what's the kind of stuff that someone could do that would really leave a bruise, like a reputational bruise or a legal bruise on people on the other side of the world? There's that kind of, like, just thinking that process through and doing a bit of risk mitigation. And what we've come up with as a board is really light at the moment. It's like, if you're thinking about starting a node, like, if you have a sense that whether it's like a regional node, like, everyone that lives in Eastern Australia, we're gonna do some community building, we're gonna have events every 6 months or something. Or it could be a thematic node, like everyone who's really interested in this particular school of facilitation or this kind of technology, like we're going to meet online, and that's going to be our like subgroup that we're organizing. That the main requirement is like talk to the board. They just, as soon as, in the same way that I announced it 2 years early saying, hey, we're anticipating this change is coming, just like open the conversation really early. And what you'll find in the board is like 4 or 5 people who are really experienced. They can just give you ideas, that can ask you good questions to help you think through like, yeah, but how is it actually going to work? And like, for example, do you need to have your own finances? And it's the node gets to decide if it's going to be running its own local finances or it's going to go through the international system that we use. Like, it's really important that you choose one way or the other, you know, that you think it through and you come up with a good guess about what's going to be the best fit. And then there's a question of like, how do people join and how do people leave? Like, think about that. Like, it's been traditional at Enspiral that joining is actually not that easy, that we have like quite a high barrier to entry. And that has meant that we have like pretty low amount of conflict that we have to deal with, because we just filter people carefully and we do some expectation management on the way in. And like, that's been important in the past in Enspiral. And a new node might say, we're gonna invite people in more easily than has been done in the past, and that's fine. But the board's gonna have some questions about like, how do you do that well? And like, at least we want you to be explicit in your choices, that you actually thought it through and you talked to some people and you like wrote something down and said, this is how membership happens, you know? So like, that's the main thing that the board is going to be doing as new nodes get started, is just like, hey, get explicit about just a couple of things before you start. And then, yeah, I can't foresee any circumstances anytime soon where the board's going to be saying no to anyone.
Makes a lot of sense, and I really like this metaphor also you used in this video. You're communicating from the board when this just happened, that it's kind of like a building code. So hey, those are important things to consider. Do you have the foundation for your house and the water system and all those little things? Or, you know, maybe you do it in a different way, that's fine, but have you thought about it and what's the outcome of this thinking process? So it feels like a very easy way of directing the work to kind of avoid some obvious mistakes that can just, you know, explode with trouble that is completely unnecessary. Just in a very simple way, while still being maybe not completely permissionless, but giving as much encouragement as possible and really opening the doors and inviting for new nodes to appear, rather than preventing the trust currency from being spent, but quite the opposite, making sure that it's being spent, but being spent well.
I think I also want to say, like, there's a risk in Enspiral that I've seen play out over and over again, that we get a new structural form and it kind of becomes cool. Like, nodes are cool. Oh, I should start a node. And it's for me, a node is like a pretty high barrier. It's like I don't expect many to form, you know, like if we had 5 nodes in 3 or 4 years, I'd be satisfied. I don't think we need a lot of them. I think of it as like a regional franchise or something, you know, like if you just want to meet with a couple of people and talk about some topics that you're into or work on a project or something, you don't need a node, you know, like you can just grab a few people together and do some stuff. But it's like, if you want to be creating a community container where lots of different activities are happening, and you have financial flows and you have explicit decision making, and yeah, you might have a public facing event, and like once it becomes a bit more sophisticated like that, then I'm like, yeah, no, a node might be a good vehicle for doing that. But I hope by doing this documentation, we don't turn into like a node marketing campaign and then suddenly there's like 30 new nodes start. That's not how it was intended.
Nodes everywhere. Join my node.
Yeah,
I have 4.
And then maybe it's worth saying as well that one of the things I anticipate is that, well, one of the requirements is that if you're going to start a node, you have to nominate a couple of delegates to like maintain communication with the board. So like if there's any questions, if we need any paperwork done, we know who to ask. And I anticipate that if we had 5 nodes around the world in a few years, we could have 2 delegates from each node and not have a board, just have a council of delegates. And that becomes the new it's like that council would make decisions about subsequent nodes forming in other parts of the world, and like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I don't know if that might be the end result of like the board has actually decentralized things in such a way that they don't exist anymore.
This is actually something I wanted to ask next. Like, what do you foresee could be the impact of creating nodes on Enspiral? And because it is a major change at the end of the day, and also removing this layer of members and contributors, it kind of all happened, let's say, in the same package of changes. What's the future going? How does it look like? What are the possible good things, but also the shady side of things?
I mean, everyone has their own focal points, right? Like, I'm just thinking about the stuff that's most obvious to me, that I'm most interested in, which is like, personally, I'm on a mission to discover what's the formula for making the most amazing community events. Like, what's a recipe that you can just play in any part of the world, where you get 30 people together for 3 or 4 days? What's the simplest set of ingredients you can do there that really activates agency and cultivates trust? And I think we know 65% of that recipe. And I want to figure it out. I want to really develop that to the point where I can put it on a 1-page PDF and ship it anywhere in the world and know that like people can follow the instructions and have a really profound experience. So I'm interested in having 5 different nodes around the world running their own version of their community gatherings, and that between us, like just increasing our learning speed, increasing the number of experiments that we're running, and in different contexts, to be able to find the patterns between the different contexts and go, this thing is really crucial. Like, we know that having an opening ceremony and a closing ceremony is powerful. Great, easy. We know that having these pods that meet every day is powerful. Great, we do that. We know that having a co-created agenda is powerful. Great, that's in there. But like I say, I think that's only 65% of the recipe. And there's a couple of other blocks missing. And once we get that, I think it's going to be really easy for people all around the world to like activate something as Enspiral-ish in their context. So that's one thing that I'm interested in, is just accelerate the learning process by running 3, 4, 5 different things in parallel without having to convince each other of, I think this is a good thing to do, like, know that you have autonomy to just do it because you think it's interesting, and you don't have to persuade the whole network to come along with you. I think that's going to be interesting to witness. I think the other part of it is like kind of related to that, is that we need, like I described my view of the world, like that what's lacking is trust. And part of the way that you accumulate trust is through hospitality, and hospitality requires hosts. Like, it requires people doing the work of inviting people in and tending to their needs and like helping the group flow. And I want to see a mass social movement of hosts, like millions more hosts than we currently have that know how to do that stuff. And if you've got, like, you can have 2 hosts running an event for 300 people, or you can have 2 hosts running an event for 12 people. And by decentralizing a bit, it means more people have to practice hosting. And we don't just like gravitate to like who's the most skilled and the one that has the most capacity and finds this the easiest. Where it's like, no, we're all going to try. Like, there's more, I think, working at that smaller scale. Yeah, it's easier to make decisions, and it's less intimidating to offer something or make an invitation to the group when there's like 20 people that you're thinking about instead of 150, and most of them you don't really know that well. And so that's the main thing. That's the main dimension that I'm thinking of. If you ask Joshua what he's thinking about, he might have a completely different story, and that's part of the fun of it, right? Like, that each node should have its own flavor, and they're like pursuing their own developmental process and learning. Like, I imagine like tunneling underground, like finding, this is a really awesome way of doing the technology side of things, or doing the financial side of things, or enabling really impactful businesses. Like, I don't know, people have their own focal points.
I hear you. It was also something when I first got introduced to Enspiral and started digging, like, wow, everybody has a different perspective and definitions, and wow, this is confusing but also very honest and real. Like, we all do, and that's fine.
If you find that level of divergence confusing, there's a secret. My definition is the correct one.
Just embrace that. You're right. Makes things easier, right? I love that.
Wow, so
Maybe
simple.
so simple. That's the recipe. Maybe that's the missing 35%. You got
This
this.
is actually my big mission in the world, is people just should listen to me and then problem solved.
I really love what you kind of framed, or how I'm wrapping my head around it, is this idea of nodes essentially being spaces to practice more, because we all need practice. And yeah, we can practice 2, 3, 4 people at the time, but also we can practice 200 people at the time. And if we do it in a bigger quantity of people, just we're gonna iterate faster, learn faster, build together faster. So if we're going towards like certain aligned vision of contributing positively to the world and building more trust in the world and building this agency, it seems like a very effective way to do it, just decentralized and allow more spaces to pop up and just make space for that. And it feels to me that Enspiral, being this very experimental space and always inviting experimentation, really succeeded in this, because it was not that difficult from the organizational point of view to make this massive change and allow this massive experiment to happen in Europe that is now shaping kind of this next chapter in Enspiral. So it feels like mission accomplished in some way, or this culture is there, is present.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on there too. One is like this culture of experimentation, of we expect leadership to come from anywhere. Like if you've got a problem, that's probably a sense that you should do something about it. You know, like there's something entrepreneurial in the culture. But then there's also the trust piece that I said. Like the reason it was pretty flawlessly easy to make this big transition is because there's no conflict. Like there's no deep, you know, there's obviously some tensions and things like that, but like there's not the baseline is really high, that most people just feel good about each other, and they're not like accumulating all these resentments that then they have to deal with, or like that come out when we try to make decisions as a group. It's like, no, we've actually cleaned up the relationships to the point where we can propose to completely change everything. And people are like, interesting. Yeah, have a go. See how that goes. Let me know. You know, instead of like getting the claws out and being really defensive and like imagining how it could go wrong and getting stuck in that loop.
Yeah, that's
and that
helpful.
That is something that I've held pretty clearly. I think for Enspiral Europe specifically is an attitude of, you know, the phrase that I use is people before projects. Like what we're doing here is building relationships, and that's like 80% of the job, and then there's 20% left over for like running companies, doing governance, running projects, doing whatever. But like the main thing is we're just building really great relationships. And that kind of rubs people up the wrong way sometimes, because they're like, hey, I want to get on with the projects. So yeah, we'll get there, but first. And this is why, like for me, this is why it's like just doing projects on top of that baseline of trust just makes things like so much more effortless and impactful and sustainable. And you know, like, and that you can recover from problems because you actually have an established relationship of like, oh yeah, you bummed me out on that thing, but I care about you in a deeper way, and so like we can deal with it. I think that's why Enspiral exists when, you know, more than a decade after it started, when a lot of other experimental communities don't last that long, because they don't put as much energy into like cultivating excellent relationships.
Yeah, I feel you. And I'm pretty sure we all experienced the other side of things, what happens. And it's usually quite nasty or just sad, because it's not like the people mean bad, or, you know, just...
Yeah, it's like there's just not enough nutrients in the system. And then like when a stress comes along, it just breaks.
I'm very curious, kind of segueing into this part about people, but also the project of Enspiral Europe node. How do we build this culture of, you know, trust building, of relationships first, of making space for experiments, for encouraging each other, for making amazing gatherings, for helping or creating space for people to practice hosting, how to make an organization or a node in Europe that does that.
Yeah. I think like I spend a lot of time in debating with people about, you know, when Nati and I moved to Europe, for example, we really talked a lot about, should we start a new community from scratch with everything we've learned and none of this baggage and just start from scratch and it'll be our thing? Or should we do an Enspiral thing? And for the longest time, we were going to not do Enspiral. And then during the pandemic, there was this kind of switch around, right, we're going to do it. We sort of changed our minds. And it does make things harder because you've got this like 12 or 13 years of history to reckon with. But after the first physical gathering that we did in France, it really stunned me the huge advantage of being like an explicit nephew of Enspiral rather than something very distantly removed. That at the end of that first gathering, like I was one of the co-hosts of that gathering, and at the end of it, we had two of the participants put their hand up to say, I'm willing to host the next one. I'll need support, but I'm willing to host it. I'll anchor it. I'll make sure it happens. And that's extraordinary. Like that's the kind of leadership transition that most organizations can only dream of. And it happened in the first gathering. And it happened because people show up to Enspiral with an expectation about what Enspiral means. And shared leadership is definitely pretty high on the list of what people expect. And so like, this is one of the surprising lessons for me about the whole experience is like the value of lineage, that there's a bunch of us, like Phoebe and Joriam and Nati and me, for example, that had a role to play in the early days, that new people come along, they've heard something about Enspiral, they've had some kind of contact, but they haven't been heavily involved. And they're like, oh, you've been really involved. So we'll just kind of follow your lead at first. And that kind of informal leadership is actually really healthy and makes things simple, because we're not all sitting around and saying, let's all figure out together what should the next step be. We're saying, who feels like they've got the next move, and like, can we support you to do it? And it started out with the people that had the most experience, and then it's like now being decentralized into people like you have come along and gone, oh, I can hold this part of the system, and people are stepping up. But I feel like the culture already existed, and that it was just like the four of us that I mentioned that just carried it like Prometheus carrying the fire, you know, like it already exists. We've got it. We'll bring it. Hey, do you want some? Yes, I do. Okay. And now it's like doing its own local breeding thing, like a yogurt, or like a mother culture or something like that. But I guess what I'm saying is there's some huge advantage to doing this inside of a lineage where it's already working rather than starting from scratch. That there's some challenges of starting with, like if you start from scratch, whoever runs the first gathering, everyone's going to expect they're going to run the second gathering. And once you've run two gatherings, then you've got like infinitely more experience than everyone else. And so it's like, obviously you'll do the third one. And it's really hard to get out of that. Once you've started getting into that feedback loop, it's really hard to then enroll everyone else as equal co-creators.
I've experienced that firsthand in Pico. So I know what you mean. Like created one gathering, then another one. It's like, hey, guys, you should do it, not just me. But yeah, I see what you mean. It's not so easy, and this advantage of having your ancestor, your lineage, and this positive impact of expectations is actually makes it so much easier for everyone, because okay, you know that this works. You still can change things and adapt it to local context. It's not just copy paste, but you have a place to start on and just keep building on top of something that already exists. And I imagine it gives people also confidence, like, okay, I got this, I see the recipe, I can replicate the recipe in my own way and host another gathering, right? Like I see what you're doing as a facilitator, and okay, so in Enspiral, this is how we do things. I can hold that piece.
There's another piece I think I want to add to this, which is in 2020, at the start of 2020, when I put up that Lumio post, that for me, making that announcement was making a commitment to my peers and saying, I'm one of the people And even if all the other ones fall out, I'm going to be one that you can count on, that for the next few years, I'm going to hold this community, and you can rely on me. And then, like I said, at the first gathering we had was in summer 2021. I think it was August 2021. And at the end of that, we had 2 people that were willing to host the next one. And so then that winter, I think it might have been, man, it's confusing. I think it was December 21, maybe 2021, that we had the winter gathering in Belgium, where the 2 hosts from the summer one had now stepped up to do it. That I had this very minimal role to play there, like just helping with some of the logistical stuff. I had none of the sort of like front seat facilitation, hosting, leadership role to play. And it was just so obvious that the second event was better than the first one in some ways, and worse in no ways. That I was saying, wow, the thing works. It's not dependent on me. It's not like I've got some magical talent, and if I'm not doing it, then the thing doesn't work. It's like, no, the system has enough. That I really remember reflecting on the gathering and going, right, I made a commitment that I would put the energy in for a few years to hold this community until it can hold itself. And by the end of the second gathering, we'd already crossed that threshold. Like, this thing holds itself. And I really felt, and I named it in one of our calls, like, I don't feel such a strong responsibility anymore. Like, I'm letting go of something that I had been holding. And that was such a sweet moment for me. And hopefully sweet for the rest of the community as well, like sweet to notice that, we're all adults now.
Beautiful rite of passage. I wonder how to summarize this. I know this is one of your super strengths, and this is actually an explicit question when I was kind of sensing into people in Enspiral who want to start their own nodes or just kind of exploring it. I ask, like, hey, what would you like to learn from our process? And one question that came up that feels very relevant for what we're talking about is, how do you build this succession of leadership and prevent this burnout of the core builders, which happens quite often? And it seems like it worked almost, maybe not effortlessly, but it was very natural and quick, and it seems very elegant and painless. So like, what is the recipe, or at least 65% of it?
Yeah. I mean, for starters, we had 4 people who knew each other well, who had a lot of Enspiral history, being the original initiators. And that helps, like knowing that you've got more than enough, because one person could kind of do it. But I really wouldn't recommend doing it with less than 2. And knowing that, like for example, pandemic comes along, Phoebe's priorities change, she's not involved so much. It's fine. Like, there's enough slack in the system. That's a big part of it. And then just being really attentive to the way that power tends to accumulate to the people that already have power, and just really proactively interrupting that tendency and going, yeah, we just did an awesome event, so who's hosting the next one? And what support do you need? And I'll do everything I can to support you, but I'm not hosting it. You are. And just make that for me, I just make that a requirement. Like, if you think this is, and you have that conversation at the end of the first gathering, like, wasn't that amazing? Aren't you feeling really high and like, wow, I really want more of this? Well, what are you going to do to contribute? Because
it ain't gonna do itself.
Unless you guys all want to pay me like a decent living to do it, then I can do it and be a professional, and I'll work like a priest or something, which is quite a different model and really hasn't been the Enspiral way. I think, yeah, like pushing for that as quickly as possible. I mean, that's part of the reason that the agenda of the retreat is co-created. It gives everyone a little taste of like, oh, if you want anything to happen, you have to lead a little bit. And hey, you've had some experience of doing that before. Maybe now you've got, some confidence to do the next one, or at least like to join as a helper. If there's no one that's ready at the end of the first gathering, if there's no one ready to say, I'm definitely going to do it, like at least find some helpers who are like, I'm committed to helping this thing happen. And then at least by the third gathering, you shouldn't be hosting, I think.
It feels like a very simple recipe to follow. And it makes a big impact, and kind of all the pieces are already there, tried and tested. And what comes up for me by hearing this is just how incredibly easy it is for someone new who's just stepping into one gathering to actually replicate this. Like, oh yeah, I can do that. And oh, this guy will support me. Oh, okay, I can do it.
And actually that becomes a design criteria for what you put in your gathering as well. So like the message I got from the last gathering I did in the States was, what's the least you can do? What's the least you can do and still know that this is going to be a really impactful experience for people? And don't add anything more than that, because the more that you add, the harder it is for people to replicate. Like the more it feels like, wow, I've got to be super experienced and skilled. It's like, no, you don't. You need a venue, you need some food. I mean, that's 80% of it. And then I think it helps if you show up in a state of like emotional centeredness and peace, and that you know how to get back to it when you get a bit anxious and stressed out. That helps. And then, yeah, like I said, pods, open space, open, closing, that's good enough. Like, and I can coach you on how to do that in 2 hours. Like, you don't need anything more sophisticated than that. And like, I guess the other piece of it is be realistic in your appetite and say like, if all we do is we have a gathering every 6 months for the next couple of years, that's enough. Like, that's enough. If what happens at the end of that 2 years is you've got 15 people who really have lifelong friendships and they want to keep coming back together, that's awesome. You know, you don't have to like refactor the whole global economy in that time. You just have to get a few people that care about each other and are going to keep showing up for each other. And once you've got that shared context, then you can start working on these like economic transformations.
It seems like a beautiful way to wrap it all up, and also put very explicit value on those relationships. Like, this is kind of at the core. It's so beautiful just to connect with other human beings, and there doesn't necessarily need to be a life-changing project emerging from there. If it does, great. Like, why not? But it's not a prerequisite, right? The prerequisite is to meet.
Yeah. And my mental model is that actually, if you do have high quality, trusting relationships, number one, you can't help but do impactful projects together, because you just like, when people really know each other and they've got some good collaboration expertise, projects just emerge, because like, oh, you're brilliant at this and I've got this skill and that person's got that skill. You just can't help but see these projects forming in front of you. And so it just happens. And secondly, when you have a tight cluster of these relationships, they're very attractive. It's like, it's got this like magnetic power, and people just want to be part of it, and it pulls them in. And it's the sweetest like motivation. It's like, I want to be part of that trusting relationship. Well, come on in, and this is what's expected of you. If you want to be part of the cool kids, like, you've got to be a high integrity person, you've got to be a generous person, you've got to be purpose driven, you've got to like, you know, like, it's a really wholesome energy source.
I feel you. Wow, this feels like so much richness all around. I have one more card for you though, which is slightly more technical, but it feels like also a good grounding of those like very high level ideas. So like, let's say you have this initial energy, you have a couple of people that are willing to host the first gathering, or maybe then the second gathering. So the energy is moving. But it's becoming clear that, okay, there is something here. It's not about just meeting anymore. We want to, start a node, or whatever node equivalent is. How do you drive this initial conversations about, like the basic agreements, the purpose, what are we do? Because that's another part, right? Like, it might be super fun and exciting to host a gathering, but the decision-making protocols and all the logistical administrative backend, not necessarily as exciting, but it still needs to happen, right? So what's the recipe for that? How do you drive this part of the story?
That the answer to that is a bit more context dependent, so it's hard to like just give one answer for everyone. But what I feel good about that we've done in Enspiral Europe is, I think we're falling into this pattern of, at every gathering, we spend at least an afternoon thinking about governance and thinking about what are the next steps, what are the structures that are needed, and doing most of the work there. And then there might be some kind of detail work that happens afterwards. But having a rhythm of governance where you say, like, ideally, there's a couple of people that have given it a bit of thought, they've got a bit of expertise, they've done some research in different places, and they're like, hey, here's my proposal. Is this good enough to get us to the next 6 months? You know, like, I think we should do decisions like this. I think we should run our finances this way, and our membership policy should be this. Can we just run that for the next 6 months and see what we learn? And get some feedback from people when they say, oh, I think you should tweak this detail and that detail, but yeah, let's go. That approach where it's explicitly time limited and you're like, we're going to be back in 6 months and we'll update it then. But like, is this good enough for now and safe enough to try? I think that's very relaxing, rather than starting from a blank slate and saying, who's got ideas about how the money could happen? You don't need people's ideas. You need people's willingness to do the work to implement a system. And it needs to be like not terribly broken. It doesn't need to be ideal. And you don't need to hear from all the people that have opinions but have got no time to contribute. Like, you just need to find like who's actually got a bit of enthusiasm and energy for this. And do they have safe enough ideas to try? And then when are we going to review them and upgrade them? Because yeah, the first few versions are going to be a bit crap.
Makes sense also what you're saying, this anchoring around gatherings, right? Which are this focal point where everyone's like, oh yeah, it's so great, we're doing this thing. So it really brings a lot of energy. It doesn't just take the energy of, you know, asynchronously spending time on a laptop and trying to type things. Like, if you can get most shit done actually on the gathering, wow. No homework. So beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And the gathering is the one moment where you know that everyone's prioritizing this thing. And then the day after the gathering, everyone's priority shift. And they've got their attention is starting to just diverge, you know, and the further it goes, the harder it is to like get everyone to pay attention to the same thing. So use that moment while you've got it, you know, like make hay while the sun shines.
That feels like a very, very good wrap up point. I don't know if there's still any other points you would like to bring, or any kind of other advices, wishes, questions, observations from this whole process of building Enspiral Europe, or any other snippets of wisdom that you would like to share?
I think just to double down on what we've both already said, which is like, there are people that want to help you with this, and don't do it alone. Like, call in the support that you need, because you're gonna, if you're following this path of building community, you are going to hit these points that are really perplexing and painful and like could break the community. So you want to know that you've got a really well-resourced squad that has your back. And if you're doing this inside of Enspiral, I'm one of those people you can call on. If you're doing it outside of Enspiral, then at very least, you can join the Micro Solidarity Network, where you'll find other people that are doing stuff like this. But you'll know, you know, who are the people you look up to, and tell them what your project is, and see if they're willing to like give you advice every 3 months for an hour. Like, that really makes a big impact on how you solve some of the really tricky dilemmas of community building.
Relational processing makes such a difference, to know there's other people that are just willing to sometimes hold space for you as you share what's happening.
Yeah.
So you can give yourself advice.
Yeah. And sometimes the advice is just like, yep, people are really annoying. That's just the way it is. And you just had to say it out loud to remember, like, yep, they're just annoying.
It happens. It's fine.
That's the solution. That's the problem solved.
Another part of the recipe. Be aware. Oh, I love it, Rich. Thank you so much for this conversation. Feels very nourishing and full of insights.
Yeah, it's fun.